Hello, everybody in the room and online. Welcome to the Weatherhead East Asia Institute and to a talk today by Dr. Kevin Fogg. Kevin is a graduate of Duke University and got his graduate degrees from Yale, all three of them, and then went on to teach at Oxford for 8 years and is a specialist on Indonesian Islam. He wrote his book, which is I guess your dissertation on the Indonesian Islamic Revolution, but looking at the role that Islam played during the revolution, something which is extremely pertinent today because of the way that hardline Islamists are trying to say that Pancasila was theirs. And that it's been misconstrued. And recently he's been working on this issue of mainline Islamic organizations, and he will explain why he uses the term mainline rather than mainstream or establishment. And it's going to be a very interesting comparison with Protestantism and mainline Protestantism. So Kevin, over to you.
I think I'll be standing, and I hope that the friends on the Zoom are able to hear me okay. I hope that y'all are able to see me a little bit. Let me just share a few slides. Okay, so hopefully our friends on Zoom can also now see these slides. As an Indonesia talk, I feel like I need to begin with in the name of the Lord, the Merciful and the Gracious. I'm delighted to have some friends here in the room. I'm delighted to have more friends online watching us live, and some who I think might be watching us after the fact. My thanks especially to Nicole Tunjing Abuitas, who invited me but is unable to get here because of transportation difficulties. So many thanks to Nicole if she's watching this after the fact. And thanks to Sidney Jones for stepping into the breach and guiding us through this talk. What I want to talk about today, Lord willing, is about, let me just make this disappear. Here we go. Is to talk about mainline Islamic organizations in Indonesia and why they're so important, right? Why these religious organizations form the backbone of Indonesian civil society, I would argue for the last 100 years or so. And also why these organizations are a bit different than ones outside of Indonesia, right? Not just that these Islamic organizations are important in Indonesia, but that they are of a different character than Islamic organizations that we find in other parts of the Muslim world, even next door in Malaysia or in Brunei or in southern Thailand. I've got 4 characteristics for why I think that these organizations are unique, right? The combination of 4 characteristics makes them different from Islamic associational life in other parts of the Muslim world. One of the things that I, as a historian, because, you know, as Sidney said, I got all those labor-intensive degrees at a university up the road, but they were all in history. And so as a historian, I want to think about how these organizations evolved over a century, right? And there are certain highs and lows and challenges and opportunities that a wide range of organizations experience together. And by looking at a bunch of them simultaneously, we can see the structural impacts, right? This wasn't just about the personalities at play in specific organizations. It was about structures in Indonesian society and history and in the Indonesian state that pushed these organizations in certain directions. And then finally, I want to highlight 3 regional organizations that don't get much play. We've got 2 big organizations in Indonesia that anybody working on the country has probably heard of. But I want to highlight 3 regional organizations that bring out those dynamics and give us a different flavor for what Islamic associational life in Indonesia looks like. Yes, here we go. So to begin with, I'm going to start off here in the States with mainline Protestant denominations, which is how scholars in the US, scholars of religion at places like Columbia, at places like University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where I'm currently based, at places like UPenn and Duke and Harvard, have talked about religious life in this country over the last century. So some of you, if you've been out to Philadelphia, may have ever seen the main line of railroads going west from Philly out into the suburbs, right, to Bryn Mawr and Villanova and out there. And the name for these denominations, right? The American Baptist Churches USA, Disciples of Christ, the Episcopal Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, PCUSA, United Church of Christ, United Methodist Church, comes actually not from their theological position being mainline. It comes from the mainline train outside of Philadelphia, because a couple of these groups, including American Baptist churches, where my mother actually worked for a couple of years, have their offices on that main line. ABC USA is at Valley Forge. But they got together about 112 years ago for a conference out on the main line, where they sort of said, we are going to be the core of religious life. At that time, more than half of the citizens of the United States were members of one of these churches, one of these denominations. And so they said, we should coordinate with one another about how we're engaged in our work in society, in our vision for where America is going forward. And since that meeting, I think it was in 1912, mainline in quotation marks and inverted commas has been used as a category in American life, usually for these denominations, but sometimes for denominations beyond these that adhere to certain key characteristics, right? Where they are large and spread around a wide geographic area, where they are theologically sort of in the middle, right? They're not radical this side, radical that side. They're theologically sort of towing the line. They're normative in the United States. And they're normative in the way that you engage in religious life in your community. Now, I was actually raised south of the Mason-Dixon line because God is merciful. And so I was raised not in one of these churches. I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church. But we in the Southern Baptist Church have a lot of these same characteristics. And so some of you might have had family members who grew up in a strong church environment where you're in church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and usually Wednesday night, where you have a youth auxiliary for women and a youth auxiliary for men, where you are engaged in social efforts and teaching in addition to the worship and the theological stuff. And so for me, this was the rhythm of daily life growing up in Virginia. This is a tradition that I know incredibly well. And so I was really struck when I first started doing research in Indonesia on Indonesian religious life, that they have many of these same structural habits, structural patterns in mass Islamic organizations that I thought of as being characteristic of mainline Protestant denominations in the US. Put it over here. Okay. So in Indonesia, like the mainline Protestant denominations, we have mass Islamic groups that dominated religious life and in many ways civil society leading up to the 1970s. From the 1970s, you get shifting modes of religious authority. Here in the US, you might think of this as being Jerry Falwell. You might think of this as being televangelists. You might think of this as being non-denominational movements, Campus Crusade for Christ, InterVarsity, a lot of the groups that you'll find on a campus like Columbia. And since the 1970s, you've seen a decline where now it's under a quarter of the United States affiliates themselves with a mainline Protestant denomination, which is a rapid change since the 1950s. And so I want to use some of the normative patterns about organization, the normative roles in national life, and the dynamics of rise and decline from the US to also then think about religious life in Indonesia. Now, what is this religious life that I'm talking about? There's two really big mass Islamic organizations that y'all have probably heard of if you've studied Indonesia at all. Nahdlatul Ulama is often called the largest Islamic organization in the world. Certainly anyone in NU calls it the largest Islamic organization in the world. And there's some basis for that, right? If you judge by the number of people who go to a mosque where the Friday preacher has some NU affiliation, they might be the largest mass Islamic organization in the world. But if you look at the number of folks who are actively involved in one of the NU auxiliaries or sub-organizations or actively thinking about NU for religious guidance, it's up in the air. The second largest organization in Indonesia is called Muhammadiyah. And there's a theological difference between these two. And any religious scholars who are really interested in the theological difference in the room? No. I mean, basically, there was a time when Muslims believed you needed to follow not just the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, but also the way that theology had then built up over the centuries with derivative interpretations of the law and then a derivative of the derivative interpretations of the law. So you get a full theological corpus that's big and complex. And the folks in NU believed in following one of those four accepted corpus, the Shafi'i corpus of jurisprudence. The folks in Muhammadiyah, founded 112 years ago, said, we don't need all of that accrued theology over 14 centuries. We can go back to the Quran and the sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself and derive this afresh. And so they're not in the schools of jurisprudence or post schools of jurisprudence. So these two large organizations have a slightly different theological approach. Many days they get along, some days they don't. There's definitely a theological difference between them. But between the two of them, they have absolutely dominated the study of Islam in Indonesia. So this is, by scholars in France. This is by scholars in Japan. This is by scholars in Australia. Indonesian scholars themselves. Indonesian scholars now based in the United States. American scholars based in the United States. I mean, we just have, dozens and dozens of works that are focused on NU and Muhammadiyah as being the sources of Islamic authority, the sources of Islamic life, the centers of civil religion for Indonesia. And that makes a lot of sense, right? These are large organizations, influential organizations. I'll tell you from one of the people on this row of books, and I won't tell you which one, was doing some field work and wanted to get numbers on these groups. And so went to the head of NU and said, how many folks are NU members? And you said, we're not really sure. Are you checking with any other organizations? And the researcher said, well, I also need to get this from Muhammadiyah. And so he said, okay, we're going to look at our books. We're going to check these numbers. Go and ask the Muhammadiyah folks first. And then, we'll be checking while you're asking them. And so he goes to Muhammadiyah. Muhammadiyah is very famous for clean organization. And so the Muhammadiyah folks say, okay, well, if you look at the number of graduates of our schools, it's this many millions. If you look at the number of people who go to our mosques, it's this many millions. If you look at the number of people who take advantage of our social welfare organizations, it's this many millions. And so he gets some number, umpteen million. After a couple of weeks, he goes back and checks with his NU contacts and says, so did you ever find a number? Here's some ways you can calculate. Did you ever find a number? And he said, yeah. So how many did Muhammadiyah say? Well, umpteen million, calculating this way. Okay, the rest are NU. And the amazing thing is the people in NU seem to truly believe that, right? They really believe that if you're a Muslim and you're not Muhammadiyah, you are generically NU. But in fact, when I look at Indonesian mass Islamic organizations, there's a lot more organizations than just those that we should think about as following this pattern of being a mainline Islamic organization in Indonesia. So I put a couple stars up here. NU and Muhammadiyah are in the red, right? Two largest ones. NU is currently based in Jakarta, although it was founded in East Java. Muhammadiyah, the headquarters is still technically in Yogyakarta, in Central Java, or Yogyakarta, a special administrative district in the central part of Java. But then you have three organizations that I am adding to the discussion in this book with deep dives. Jamiyatul Washliyah, based in North Sumatra, founded up in Medan, although they moved their headquarters to Jakarta in the 1970s. Nahdlatul Ulama is based here on Lombok, the island east of Bali. And then Alkhairaat is based in Palu, central Sulawesi. But those aren't the only ones, right? Oh, let me go back. Sorry about that. We've also got, like PUSA, founded in the 1930s in Aceh. You've got PERTI, Persatuan Tarbiyah Islamiyah, the Indonesian Islamic Educational Union. Mathal Anwar, based in West Sumatra. Darul Da'wah Irsyad, based in South Sulawesi. There's even organizations like Mushawaratul Talibin that rose in the same era. This is the star that I have in South Kalimantan. Mushawaratul Talibin, large, influential organization. A later speaker of the Indonesian parliament, Idham Khalid, came out of Mushawaratul Talibin. But Mushawaratul Talibin is one of the organizations that did not survive the Japanese occupation in Indonesia, when civil society kind of got either smashed or set aside in a lot of parts of the country, especially outside of Java. Civil society was really sidelined. These organizations are spread across the archipelago, certainly across the Muslim parts of the archipelago. These organizations are fairly dominant in their provinces, right? An organization like Nahdlatul Ulama has had someone in either the governor's office or the lieutenant governor's office for the last 17 years. The largest caucus in the North Sumatra provincial legislature is the Jamiyatul Washliyah caucus. And so these organizations, even though they're not NU and Muhammadiyah, are very influential and important in their regions. And that's why I want to bring them into the conversation. Okay. So how am I defining a mainline Islamic organization? And how is it different from some other groups? So I've chewed on this for a while, and I've come up with 4 conditions that I think all of these groups that were on the map meet, and other organizations don't meet all four. So here's what I'm working with. First, these organizations are large, influential, and comprehensive. Large makes sense. This means millions of followers. And all of the groups, even the smallest ones on my map, have literally millions of followers. Remember that Indonesia's quite a large population, quite a large Muslim population. So you can have 3 million followers and dominate a province and still not be a big player on the national scene. They're influential locally in politics, but also in social life, right? These are the folks who are telling you when you should observe the holy days, right? Who's seen the moon for Eid al-Fitr, which we had last week, for example. And they're also comprehensive. Now, what does that mean? Comprehensive in the sense that they're not just providing education, they're not just providing social works, they're not just engaged in proselytization, but they're engaged in all of these facets of activity as an organization. The joke for this is usually around Muhammadiyah because it's such a comprehensive organization that they're normative in this way. So you can be born in a Muhammadiyah hospital because Muhammadiyah runs hospitals. And then you can go to a Muhammadiyah preschool, and then you go to a Muhammadiyah elementary school, middle school, high school. While you're doing that, maybe you're doing your shopping at a Muhammadiyah supermarket, right? You go to a Muhammadiyah university. On Thursday nights after you graduate from university, you're still getting together with a Muhammadiyah prayer group or a Muhammadiyah study group. You eventually retire and you live in a Muhammadiyah retirement home. And then when you're buried, a Muhammadiyah Islamic leader, a Muhammadiyah alim, does your funeral and buries you in a Muhammadiyah cemetery, right? So when these people are comprehensive, they are comprehensive literally from cradle until grave, right? They're engaged not just in the education, not just in the theological guidance, in propagation, but also in the social works. And so these organizations are impressive in the scope that they hold. A lot of places you have organizations that might be large and influential, but they're not comprehensive. They might just be doing education. Sometimes you have groups that are comprehensive, but they're not that large or influential, right? They're comprehensive for a small community. One of the things that stands out about Indonesian organizations, they are large, influential, and comprehensive. Secondly, they are modern in form. Now, sometimes when I say this, I get folks who are Shafi'i in jurisprudence, right? Who follow the 14 centuries of accrued theology, and they say, oh, we're not modernist. I'm saying, no, theologically, you are holding to a staunch, well-established and well-understood line of theology. But in form, these things are modern because they come with a constitution and bylaws. All of them have a constitution and bylaws. They come with regular conventions to choose their leaders, right? Sometimes every 3 years, sometimes every 5. Depends on the organization, how they set that up. But they will have regular conventions. They will have official positions in the organization, like secretary, like treasurer, like vice chair of the social affairs committee for this province, right? And so all of that trapping of modernity, right? The trappings of organizational modernity sets Indonesian organizations apart from some of the organizations that you might see, for example, in northern Nigeria, from some of the Sufi-inspired organizations that you might see in a place like Turkey, right? A lot of those groups are not open and straightforward and modern in their organization. And so they don't have those trappings of modernity. Now, Sidney pressed me on this a little bit earlier, saying, oh, well, some of these groups, like NU, it's never actually a question going into the convention, who's going to get elected leader. That's probably true. But the fact that it's important for the NU leaders to go through the trappings of organizational modernity is still important. The fact that they have a constitution and bylaws that they can use to protect the organization or to use against their critics or whatever it is, they are using these organizational trappings in a way that you would not have seen in Indonesia before 1910. And that to me is important, that Indonesian religious life, Indonesian Islamic life, chooses to use those trappings as a core part of how they organize Muslim associationalism. So that's modern in form. And then 2 conditions about the relationship of these groups to the state. One, all of these groups that I'm talking about in Indonesia support the Indonesian state. They support the idea of Indonesia. They don't always support the specific politician in power, but they think that Indonesia makes sense as the governance vehicle for their followings. That was true before Indonesia became independent. I have argued in the past, and my book on the Indonesian Revolution was mentioned, that groups like Muhammadiyah, groups like NU, were very invested in Indonesian nationalism and literally fought, spilled blood in order to achieve Indonesian independence. But since Indonesia became independent, these groups are the ones who have said, yes, we like the idea of Indonesia in this form, all of these islands together. We accept the idea of Indonesia with its constitution. They have tried to change it, but through democratic means. These groups have not gone into rebellion. We think that Indonesia is the correct political vehicle. We are not advocating for pan-Islamism, where we unite under a caliphate, run out of somewhere by a someone. And so these groups are fundamentally nationalists. The picture that you see here is actually a group of, it's in North Maluku, so the place that we get our spices from, the place that launched colonialism in Ternate, because of the cloves and the nutmeg that European adventurers wanted to buy and bring back to Europe. That place is very strongly pro-Alkhairaat. And so you see here a group of young female students marching down the street carrying Indonesian flags. And then you can almost see here in the middle, this thing right here. Let's try that. Okay, this thing right here is a portrait of the founder of Alkhairaat that they are carrying like under an Indonesian flag, right? That their great alim, their great leader of this organization is pro-nationalist. That man never spoke Indonesian. He only spoke Arabic his entire life. And yet he is taken as an Indonesian nationalist. A fascinating thing just to show how much they support the state. But then these groups, even though they support the state, they are, and this is a thing that we could debate in the current moment, but as a general rule over the last 100 years, they are not controlled by the state. One of the examples I use for this, last week Indonesian had Idul Fitr, the holiday for the end of the fasting month of Ramadan. And the state of Indonesia generally follows the Islamic organizations on what day you're going to name as Idul Fitr, right? There's a minister of religion. The minister of religion can pass an official decree on this, but he's looking at NU and Muhammadiyah and saying, when do they say that Eid will begin? When do they say that Ramadan will begin and then Ramadan will end? It's these organizations that are dictating things to the state. The state is not able to tell them traditionally and generally who will become the next head of the organization. The state is not going to dictate to them theological positions, although the state might put up strong boundaries of what falls in and what falls out, and enforce some penalties on the organizations when they do something that falls out. And some of the organizations I'm looking at have done that, especially under the Suharto regime. They were advocating for positions that the Suharto regime didn't particularly like. In recent years, there's been a lot of debate about how these groups are being cowed by the state, but I still don't think they're controlled by it, a thing we can debate. These four conditions, to me, when you hold all four of them, it strikes me as peculiar. It strikes me as notable that all of the 10, dozen, however many it is, organizations in Indonesia that I would categorize as mainline can meet all four of these conditions. And I have not found an organization outside of Indonesia that meets all four, right? When we think about something like the Muslim Brotherhood, its relationship with the state is very different from this. When we think about Sufi organizations, when we think about diaspora organizations that might be comprehensive but are not large and influential, it's very hard to get an organization outside of Indonesia that meets all four of these. Even in neighboring Malaysia, you don't have organizations that are truly independent of the state, right? In Malaysia, Islam is really much more strongly controlled by the state, and often at that local level, at that provincial level in Malaysia. The local king is the final say on Islam in Perak or in Kedah. And so it's hard to get that independent voice. So these are my four conditions for a mainline Islamic organization in Indonesia. Okay. Oddly enough, those same four characteristics could describe America's mainline Protestant denominations as well, right? Large, influential, and comprehensive. I don't know if y'all have this as much up here, but the second largest medical group in North Carolina, where I'm working, is Baptist Medical Group, right? The Baptists in the U.S. have done all of those comprehensive things. Definitely modern informed. My mother and my grandfather are past presidents of the Virginia Baptist General Assembly, right? They have to meet every year. They have to elect a president. They follow a constitution and bylaws. They are supportive of the state, right? In fact, they align their jurisdictions with the legal jurisdictions of the United States in the same way that Indonesian organizations divide up their jurisdictions within NU or Muhammadiyah or Alkhairaat with the provinces of Indonesia. Perfect alignment geographically. And yet they're not controlled by it. And so it's striking to me that American mainline organizations meet these exact same characteristics that Indonesian, what I would call mainline organizations do. This is about halfway through. And so this is the time where folks generally let their minds wander. And I thought this might be a good time to let minds wander I better hold this so folks who are watching this asynchronously or watching us online can see. Just to give you an idea of how comprehensive these things are, I've brought a couple of show and tell items. So, for example, if you are a college student on Lombok, you can be in the college student auxiliary of Nahdlatul Ulama. And I actually was given a medal by Hima, which was lovely, for giving a little talk to them. So just these kind of accoutrements go around. Also from Nahdlatul Ulama, a pocket handbook of the poetry of the founder of Nahdlatul Ulama. Most of this is in Indonesian, that's transcribed in the Roman letters, so you can see it, but it's all sort of quatrains. The middle section of this is actually poems of 5 lines, but the first line is always Aduh sayang, oh my beloved. And so these pockets, pocket books that folks will carry around literally as sort of an amulet almost of the organization. And then they even come with flags, right? So this is the flag.
I can open it.
Well, we better hold it together here.
Okay.
This is the flag of the Nahdlatul Ulama school, Nahdlatul Ulama Dunia Islamiyah, and I better turn it actually. So if we turn it this way, okay. For those of y'all who are real Indonesian geography buffs, you can see the outline on here of the island of Lombok. So this is the island of Lombok shape right there inside the star. And then inside of that, you get the symbol of Nahdlatul Ulama. So these flags you actually see flying on the island of Lombok, not just outside schools, but outside of homes, right? They have all of these trappings. Okay, so let me pass this one around. I want all these things back. It took me a long time to get them, but I thought I'd show them. The organizations have their own newspapers. So I brought a couple of photocopies of the Alkhairaat newspaper from the 1970s when it started, right? They send it out once a week, but they're sending this out with some guidance on what you should preach about on Friday. But then also just like local stuff. So what are the common diseases in our area and how can we help to alleviate them, right? What's the news about the latest prices in coconut, right? Because that's one of the major products in Central Sulawesi. So they put out their own newspapers. Mm-hmm. In fact, the largest continually published newspaper in Indonesia is the Muhammadiyah newspaper. So they're important not just for their own members, but in the history of Indonesia, these things are quite notable. And then they put out plenty of educational materials. This VCD that I brought is songs that you can sing with preschool-age children to teach them religious doctrines from Al-Washliyah in Medan. They've got a fantastically voiced choir of women in their women's auxiliaries singing on this thing. Makes sense. North Sumatra is a place that's kind of famous for sitting around and singing on street corners. And so they do their own singing here. So I'm just going to pass those around in case folks are getting a little bit weary of listening to me talk right before lunch or right after lunch. Okay. These organizations have evolved over the 20th century in ways that I find to be interesting and parallel. Most of the organizations began in the 1910s and 20s, and a lot of them began in competition with Christian missionaries. So Muhammadiyah, which was founded in 1911, was engaged in social enterprises early on, partly because Christian missionaries, many of them Dutch, had come in and were engaged in social enterprises in places like Jakarta. And so when a Catholic hospital gets set up, the Muslims are like, oh, we better set up a Muslim hospital. When the Catholics are engaged in that kind of formal education that has grades and classes and graduations, the Muslims said, oh, well, we should engage in that kind of formal education that has grades and class and education so they wouldn't be left behind by the Christian organizations. So I think one of the things that folks haven't paid enough attention to, that folks haven't been entirely honest about, is that some of the form that was taken up by mass Islamic organizations in Indonesia early on was form adopted from Christian missionary organizations that were operative in Indonesia from the teens and 20s. When Muhammadiyah was founded in 1911, they're the forerunner and in many ways the model, the normative example of a mass Islamic organization. And so you had other groups that then were competing with Muhammadiyah. And so in the 1920s and into the 1930s even, you get just this huge wave, this plethora of organizations. Almost every province where I've done work in the Dutch archives on this had some organization pop up that said, we're going to be the organization that is not Muhammadiyah, right? We're going to be the organization that protects the theological belief in those 1,400 years of accrued theology. A lot of those groups did not survive into the 1940s because the Japanese occupation was quite harsh. So in Gorontalo, for example, you see Nahdlatul Shafi'iyah, right? the emergence or the renaissance of the Shafi'is, right? The people who follow the school of jurisprudence. I already mentioned Mushawarat al-Talabin, the consultation of the religious students that rose up in Banjarmasin in Kalimantan. But then you get groups like Porti in West Sumatra that did survive. You get groups like Jamiyatul Washliyah formed in Medan that is very active until this day, right? That were founded in a lot of ways in competition with Muhammadiyah, right? Muhammadiyah makes it into their province and they say, we like all these things. We like having the schools and the social activities and the outreach, the religious outreach, but we don't want to be Muhammadiyah. And so they're engaged in that competition with Muhammadiyah, not just with Christian missionaries. One of the characteristics that I have found of the groups that did survive through the 1930s and into the 40s, the ones that were engaged in more propagation work, more religious conversion work, were more likely to survive because they weren't just saying, we're not Muhammadiyah. They're saying, we're not Muhammadiyah and we want to spread this message to others. So this image that you see of the light of Islam held as a candle in the hands of Jamiyatul Washliyah is coming down into a traditionally Batak village. The Batak were an ethnic community in North Sumatra that were not, as a majority, converted to a world religion at the beginning of the 20th century. Many of them are today Christian. Some of them are today Muslim. Jamiyatul Washliyah was very dedicated to propagating Islam in Batak lands. And so you see them here, sort of, this is the cover of their 5-year anniversary of their special Islamic mission for sending out to Batak areas. There's another thing that happens in the 1920s and 30s and even into the 40s that you get a bunch of schools that are founded in that new form, right? The idea that you'll have a school that is teaching not just Islamic subjects, not just how to recite texts, but also math or statistics or languages other than Arabic, right? You know, teaching Indonesian, but maybe even teaching Dutch or English. Those kinds of schools were propagating all over the country in the 1920s. And then in the 1930s, many of them would begin to establish new branch campuses. So if my headquarters is maybe, you know, let's say 118th Street, and then I establish a branch campus from one of my alumni who starts something down on 79th, you know, maybe I'll call this Columbia Islamic School, and then there'll be Columbia Islamic School 79th, and then they'll establish a branch over in Queens somewhere. Those schools were just loose networks in the 1930s, 1920s and 30s. And then those schools sometimes became the second wave of Islamic organizations in the 1940s and 50s, right? That it wasn't enough for me to just say, oh yeah, Columbia Islamic School here on 118th has this other school on 79th, has this other school in Queens. We wanted to establish a formal organization of these schools and then give it a constitution and bylaws, give it a sort of annual meeting, officers, all of these things. Because by doing that in the 1940s and 50s, we were able to capture government largesse, right? By organizing ourselves formally, we were able to get our guys in to become the district officiant of marriages, to become the head of the district office of religious affairs. By organizing formally, we were able to capture those really good government pension jobs. And that spurred a bunch of these loose, you know, networks of schools to become formal organizations in the 40s and 50s. From the 1930s to the 1950s, these groups were very strong proponents of Indonesian nationalism. One of the reasons why they have such a great footprint in the Dutch archives, like Nahdlatul Ulama, which you see on the side here, this is from Dutch archives of 1936, from Gorontalo, is because the Dutch saw them as a threat because they were constantly advocating for Indonesian independence, first for more Indonesian self-determination, but then for out and out independence from the Dutch. But I think the peak of these organizations was in the 1950s. They were fueled by Islamic politics, so there was a big debate and sometimes even battle in society about whether Indonesia would be based on Islam or whether Indonesia would be based on a non-sectarian motto called Pancasila. It's not non-religious, but it's non-sectarian between Islam, Christianity, and other faiths. And so that is fueling people to be very active in their Islamic organizations if they are Muslim, right? Because you've got this debate going on in society, a lot of polarization between Muslims and either non-pious Muslims or non-Muslims. This is also a moment when they have a big sort of reputational bonus from the work that they had done to advocate for Indonesian independence, right? These are folks who said, we were on the forefront in our local community of organizing a militia that fought against the Dutch in the 1940s. Muhammadiyah reaps a big benefit from that because they are seen as the the forerunners, the pioneers of fighting for Indonesian independence in places even like Sumbawa, not just only on Java or on Sumatra. This is a time when they are providing a lot of the services that the Indonesian state does not yet have the organizational capacity to provide. So in the 1950s, the Indonesian state was not able to provide elementary schools, middle schools, high schools to meet the demand of the Indonesian people. And so a much larger proportion of the population was going to schools provided by these mass Islamic organizations, which is another thing that contributed to their sort of organizational peak in the 1950s and early 1960s. I would say in the United States, we would also call the 1950s the peak of the influence of American Protestantism, of mainline denominations on US political and social life. The 1960s through the 1980s is a bit of a wilderness for these folks, and there's a couple reasons for that. One is the army-backed authoritarian regime that came in from 1966 through 1998 was much less interested in accommodating these organizations and really wanted to limit political Islam. Some of these organizations chose to take an oppositional stance. Jamiyatul Washliyah in Medan is a famous one of those, that said, we will not accommodate what Suharto is trying to do, sidelining Islam in this country. And so they actually lost a number of lucrative gigs for them, right? They had been running the Friday prayers on the local radio station, lost that gig because they were too oppositional towards the Suharto regime. Another thing that was happening at this moment is a really difficult generational transition, right? The young guys who had founded some of these organizations in the 1930s were passing away. So if you were, in your 20s, let's say in the 1930s, by the 1960s, 1970s, you're passing away. So this is happening for Jamiyatul Washliyah. This is happening for Alkhairaat, based in Central Sulawesi. This is happening for Perti, based in West Sumatra. Mathul Anwar, Persatuan Umat Islam, right, are losing their leaders in the 60s and 70s. And that next generation, although they are well-established Islamic scholars, they have a lot of good knowledge, they didn't have the relationships with every single branch, having been the head teacher for all those years. Choosing who's going to be the successor can sometimes be very contentious in these organizations. And just that magic dust isn't there. And so a lot of these organizations are losing some of their tightness, losing some of their cohesion in that generational transition, which puts them into a bit of a wilderness, not just politically, but organizationally in the 60s through the 80s. They come back in a pretty strong way in the 1990s and 2000s. And this is something where I'm echoing the field, right? Talking about the rise of an Islamic civil society in the 1990s as part of the opposition to the late Suharto regime. You see here the three leaders of Indonesian politics in the immediate post-Suharto moment. Megawati Soekarno Putri, the woman that you see who's on the left of this image, not an Islamic leader. She comes from a political dynasty. But then the two fellows next to her, Abdurrahman Wahid in the center was the leader of NU, right, the largest mass Islamic organization. And then Amin Rais was the head of Muhammadiyah, right? It's not a coincidence that the two largest mass Islamic organizations in Indonesia also transformed into having the leaders of the president elected in 1999 by parliament and the speaker of parliament, I think Amin Rais was, in that post-transition era. Mass Islamic organizations were once again the backbone of life, of civil life in opposition to Suharto. At the same time, there are some structural transformations happening in Indonesia that were undermining what could have been big gains for them in this period. As more Indonesians moved to cities, they became less connected to the Islamic organizations that were providing services in rural areas, right? In cities, you get more government services. That's just a fact of Indonesian life. But also in cities, you're getting new types of Islamic authority, right? You're getting folks who are not connected to the Islamic organizations who can start a school or a mosque or a prayer group in cities. You're getting more Indonesian students who are going off to university and being sucked into the new kinds of Islamic organization, especially the quote-unquote Tarbiyah movement, today often thought of as aligned with PKS, the Partai Keadilan Sejahtera in Indonesian politics. Those folks are being pulled out of organizations, right? A high-performing, well-educated generation that could have been the next leaders of Muhammadiyah or Darul Da'wah wal Irshad instead are going to PKS because that's who's most active on university campuses. You're also getting accusations in this period of the Islamic organizations losing their old identity theologically, right? You're getting some new liberal tendencies, right? Along with democratization, there's new discourse around gender. There's new discourse around tolerance for other religious communities. And do we really need to be engaged in conversion? And so there's debates about liberalism, secularism, other things emerging in the 1990s in a fresh way that undermines the reputation of some of these longstanding mainline organizations in Indonesia. Anyone who's been in the United States for the last 30 years recognizes all of those same debates here, right? The fact that my mother got elected as the president of the Virginia Baptist General Assembly was contentious for some people who think that women shouldn't be leaders in Baptist life. Same debates going on in Indonesia. Not quite at the same level, right? You did not have a female head of any of these organizations until 1999, and that was only because she was the daughter of a founder of the organization that passed away. But similar questions are arising around the world and arising certainly in Indonesia in the 1990s. And with mass communications, those things can bounce around a whole lot faster. You're getting communications that are not dominated by the organization. It's no longer just the Alkhairaat newspaper that's circulating in Central Sulawesi. You're getting new types of ways to communicate by text message, by printing your own things, by photocopying. That is so much easier able to penetrate into even the villages. That it's not just the folks in urban spaces, that you're getting a new challenge to the authority with those new means of communication. So that leaves us with the question of, was the 1990s and early 2000s a heyday or a swan song for these mainline Islamic organizations? Now, let me just quickly, and I know that we're running tight on time, introduce the three groups that I think are really interesting, that don't get a lot of play, certainly in English and even in Indonesian. But looking at these groups alongside NU and Muhammadiyah gives us a better idea of what is common, what is structural, versus what is unique to specific organizations. All three of these groups identify themselves as being the third largest in Indonesia. Now, that cannot possibly be the case. But it does give you a sense that they're all super influential in their regions, right? All of them say, oh yes, there's NU and Muhammadiyah, and then there's us. And because they're active in different corners of the archipelago, that kind of makes sense. Jamiyatul Washliyah was founded by a collective of students in Medan, North Sumatra, first as a debating society in 1930. They started to found a bunch of schools. They started to try and convert Batak people to Islam, and they were racing against Christian missionaries at the same time. One of the real challenges in Jamiyatul Washliyah is that they were an organization from 1930s. They were an organization earlier than others. And they became a member organization of the Islamic political party Masyumi when that was founded, and created a special, it's called Anggota Istimewa, right? A special member category for Islamic organizations at its founding in 1945. Because of that, Jamiyatul Washliyah has been more involved in politics from earlier on than a lot of the other regional organizations, right? Alkhairaat, Nahdlatul Ulama, that I'll talk about, didn't have as direct of a political affiliation in the 1950s. Since the 1950s, it's been really hard for Jamiyatul Washliyah to balance that political mission, right? Having an explicit orientation as a special member of a political party with the educational and social mission that they also carry. And so Jamiyatul Washliyah was hit harder than some of these other groups when they were in the political wilderness in the 1970s. For those of you who know Indonesian Islam well, you might have heard of Ustaz Abdul Somad, UAS, who was educated entirely at Jamiyatul Washliyah schools, but chooses not to affiliate with that organization anymore. He's tried to wipe that out of his biography. But if you actually look at the man, Jamiyatul Washliyah schools until he graduated from high school. So that's just, one voice coming out of this Sumatran organization. Jamiyatul Washliyah did actually move their headquarters to Jakarta in the 1970s as part of, because Suharto saw them as the third largest in the country at the time. Part of the centralizing push was national organizations should have a national headquarters in Jakarta. So they participated in that. Next up is Nahdlatul Watan. So Nahdlatul Watan, fascinating thing, because it's a very orthodox organization in a lot of ways, but it's a very Sasak organization in a lot of ways. Sasak is the majority ethnicity on Lombok, that island east of Bali. And so a Sasak Haji went off to Mecca and Medina, the holy city of Islam, and studied for about 7 years at a school there, Madrasah Salatiyah, that's made a bunch of educational leaders, not just in Southeast Asia, but in South Asia and other parts of the Muslim world. And when he came back, he wanted to establish a really intense training school that would educate folks in good Arabic, serious theology, but then also provide some of those other skills, right? How to do math, how to speak Dutch. Later on, they changed it to English. When he came back and founded that school, he called it Nahdlatul Watan Diniyah Islamiyah, which means Renaissance of the nation, right? Watan is the word for nation. This is the same Nahdlatul as Nahdlatul Ulama, right, NU. But Nahdlatul Watan sounds very, very nationalist. Founding that in 1935 was a bit of a sign to our friends in the Dutch colonial government that this was going to be a nationalist organization. At the same time, in 1935, it could have been a little bit unclear. Is that nation Indonesia, or is it the Sasak nation? Because he was engaged in a bunch of local ethnic traditional practices that you just don't find anywhere else, right? The founder of this group, Muhammad Zainuddin Abdul Majid, believed in some of the traditions about the mountain at the center of Lombok, Gunung Ranjani, and the spirit guardians of that thing. And he would make pilgrimages up to the mountain. And if you look at the little pocket-sized handbook of his poetry, he's invoking some of the mythical goddesses that guard the mountain of Ranjani. Dewi Anjani is one of them, famously. And so he's both very orthodox, right? He's teaching a lot of good Arabic. He's teaching people, very clear guidelines for how to live in line with the Quran. But he's also doing things like, when he holds a major social event, he will engage in cutting, the first haircut for a Sasak toddler, which is one of the 4 transitions in traditional Sasak life, right? So he's integrating that Sasak identity with the Islamic identity, which made him incredibly successful at bringing a lot more Sasak people in line with textual, modern, theologically reformed Islam. That fellow lived until the age of at least 91. There's some debate about how old he was exactly when he passed away, but he lived until the age of at least 91, which was 1997. And what a time to pass away, because Indonesia was in the middle of a political transition. And so they had this wild thing that happened at his passing, where there were 2 factions for who should take over. He had designated his son-in-law, that he only had 2 children, the founder, only had 2 children. They were both daughters. He had tried to make his son-in-law from his elder daughter the head in the 1970s, didn't go anywhere. Failed. He took back control for another 20 years. He had designated his son-in-law through his younger daughter as his successor. But wouldn't you know it, because he lived to the age of 91, his son-in-law through the older daughter passed away 40 days before he did in 1997. And it was unclear who was going to be the head. They go to a convention, they go to the Mu'tamar. Out of the clear western sky, the younger daughter is named as the head of this organization. So you have a woman who is the head of a mass Islamic organization in Indonesia in 1997. Wild, unheard of, pretty radical, and pretty controversial even for people within the organization, especially her own sister, who said, well, if it was on the table that a woman could become head, why didn't I become head? I'm the older sister. Well, there's some things about that, right? They're from different wives, because Muhammad Zainuddin Abdul Majid had multiple wives. The older sister's husband had been estranged from the organization. She had divorced the man and married someone else. I mean, there's a bunch of things here. But the older sister was very unhappy about this, and as were a lot of other people, including one of the brothers of the founder and some others. And so they held what was called a Mu'tamar Reformasi, right? This was the Reformation era in Indonesian politics. So they had a Reformation Congress and named the son of the elder daughter, this man that you see in the political poster here, Tuan Guru Bajang, as the head of the organization in a rival Congress. And so Nahdlatul Ulama has basically been split since 1997. Now, 2 years ago, they had a government-mediated reconciliation that all it really did was formalize the split of this into 2 different things. So before, the school was called NWDI, NWDI, Nahdlatul Watan Diniyah Islamiyah, and the organization was just called Nahdlatul Watan. And now NWDI and NW have become separate organizations as of 2021. The sisters faction, who became the head, is the NW faction, and the grandsons faction, this fella, became NWDI. They're no longer as violent as they were in 1998, 99, but there's still tension on the island between these 2 groups. Plenty of fascinating things going on there. But let me just point out Alkhairaat, the last organization that I'll mention, which was founded actually by an Arab as a school in 1930. This is a Hadrami Arab. So the majority of Arabs in Indonesia are Hadramis, right, coming from that part of southern Yemen. And Sayyid Idris bin Salam al-Jufri, he's called Sayyid because he claims descent from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he had been from a family of traders that had gone back and forth between Yemen and Indonesia for generations, right? But with the erection of national borders and citizenship in a new way in the 20th century, it became a time where if you go to a place, you kind of stay there. It's harder to just go back and forth in an itinerant lifestyle. So he was called to come to Indonesia, had a family on Java, went off to Sulawesi trading, and the local Arabs in Sulawesi said, we so desperately need a teacher here. Please, would you stay? And found a school. And so in addition to trading, Sayyid Idris founded a school in first Donggala and then Palu, that trained up so many students, and students from not just Palu area, but from across central Sulawesi and then northern Sulawesi, and then from Kalimantan and then from North Maluku. Because as a trader, he would go out and trade goods in all these places. He would go out with a full boat or a full oxen cart of goods. He would come back with a full boat or full oxen cart of students. And then he would send his graduates off to their home villages. They became this huge network. Now, they only became an organization in 1956. And this picture is from that first organizational conference. You can see the different towns from across Sulawesi and a couple from, so this is Palu, a couple from the Moluccas are also in here. They agreed to an organizational standard, they agreed to a constitution and bylaws, but they said all of us from this broad, ethnically heterogeneous region will stay under the leadership of an Arab. So you need to be in the family of Said Idris to be the Ketua Utama, the ultimate head of the organization. But then the organization is actually run day to day by a secretary general, the third position in this group. And in the secretary general position, Alkhairaat has been more diverse than any other organization I know in Indonesia. From the 1970s, Alkhairaat had a Chinese Indonesian secretary general, Muslim convert, Chinese Indonesian, pretty wild. They've had Bugis, they've had Kaili, they've had Banjar, they've had Una. They've had, all different ethnicities in that secgen position. There's a bit of a joke that you kind of need to add to the ethnic heterogeneity of the organization to be a really good candidate for secgen these days. Although they have had some repeats in the Kaili, which is the ethnicity around Palu, where the headquarters is. Now, Alkhairaat, because of this Arab identity, a lot of the writing in English has focused on it as an Arab organization. But if you get down to the grassroots, actually most of the members of Alkhairaat are not Arab. But they respect that Arab leadership, which makes them an interesting group to think through as a different flavor in the spectrum of Indonesian mass Islamic organizations. Now, I've talked for a long time, and thank you all for your patience. Thanks for the patience also of those who are watching us synchronously online or watching this after the fact. Let me end with two questions to then lean into y'all's questions. So first, thinking about all of these groups together, how does mapping these groups help us to understand how Indonesia is unique in the Muslim world, right? A lot of times folks talk about Indonesia is different from other Muslim countries. Is that because of the structural reasons of these mass Islamic organizations having people affiliate together as Muslims in a different way than other parts of the Muslim world? And then secondly, because we are based here in the United States, because I've got that great Southern Baptist background, is the analogy to mainline Protestant denominations useful to think about Indonesia not just in the context of the Muslim world, but Indonesia in the context of religious change over the last century around the world, right? Some of the same transformations that were happening in terms of religious communication, in terms of debates about liberalism, are not just unique to Indonesia, but common even in the United States in Christian communities. I've talked an awful lot. I talk very fast. Thank you so much for your patience. Saya mohon maaf kalau ada kesalahan, kekurangan dalam perbincangan ini.